You're listening to the Hella Well with Danielle show, a podcast taking women of color on a journey exploring all things wellness and travel related. We're all about showing you how to put on your oxygen mask first and creating lasting self-care habits that will free you to travel the world and live the life you truly desire, and not one you have to fake loving. I'm your host, Danielle Washington. Now let's buckle up and start this journey. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Hella Well with Danielle podcast. I am your host, Danielle Washington, and I just got back from a trip to Morocco and Portugal. And this is actually my first trip since the pandemic, like my first international trip. And it was one of those things that I won't lie, I was kind of nervous. I didn't know what to expect. And in the preparation for planning this trip, because it wasn't just a trip that I was planning, I was actually planning a retreat for 40 women. I had a lot of things that I had to consider that I didn't normally consider, pre-pandemic. And so I was like, let's make a podcast episode on international travel mistakes to avoid while traveling during the pandemic and during COVID. Because I feel like there's a lot of things I wouldn't have thought about if I was maybe by myself, or if I hadn't traveled a lot in life, or if I wasn't bringing 40 other people to making sure that they were safe. And so, because there was things that just popped up that was like, there were so many challenges and observations that just made travel just different during this time frame. And I guess, with it being 20 years after 9/11, we don't think about how travel was before then, but there were a lot of changes that happened, right after that kind of changed how we traveled. And right now, yes, people are traveling. Don't let the media fool you like, oh my God, the travel industry is hurting. Yes, they are hurting, but people are still traveling. And I can tell you from personal experience, looking at those hella long custom lines, being in hella full planes when you're like, are people social distancing? Not so much, because why is this person sitting right next to me and I don't know you like that? So hopefully this podcast episode will help you navigate the waters and the airs and the accommodations of what it means to travel internationally and avoiding these mistakes so you don't get caught out there in issues. So I'm going to start off kind of like going through things like pre-travel, what to do when you're like actually at the airport and like on a plane, accommodations, and just some basic things. So the first thing I highly recommend is to make sure that you're keeping track of constantly changing guidelines and destinations for your destinations and just all that. Things are changing. Things were changing constantly. In the midst of planning for this trip, we went from, CDC has travel advisories as a level 1 to 4. We went from a level 2 to a level 3 to a level 4 throughout this entire period. And so if I wasn't constantly checking, I would have been like, oh, wait, why is there this curfew? Why do I have these new, things I can't do in Morocco? But because I was constantly tracking the changing restrictions and guidelines that are happening and like learning okay, what was going on in terms of the COVID tests. For example, before we got there, Morocco was, when you need a COVID test to get back in the United States. And so to pay for a COVID test in Morocco when we first landed, we were only there for like 6-7 days. When we first landed, the cost was 700 dirhams, which is like $70. But however, in the midst of us being there, and luckily I was checking and paying attention, the cost changed because the government changed from 700 dirhams to 450 dirhams. So it went from $70 ish to around $45. But if we weren't paying attention, I'm not saying people wouldn't have been honest about it, but we could have prepaid, $70 when the cost had changed by the time we actually took the test to about $45. And that's one of those things with always constantly checking about what's going on with restrictions, what are changes happening while you're there. We had curfews going on, there was issues and restrictions about how many people could be traveling together. And one of the places to always check if you are looking for how things are changing with restrictions is looking at the U.S. State Department's website. They always have information about traveling to certain countries. The CDC has travel guides for per country. So it'll kind of give you, what are the restrictions of getting into the country, getting out of the country, what's going on, are there curfews, what's the travel advisory, and also looking at the country's own website for travel, and they will give you information about what is going on. And that's how, I was reading about the curfews and what was changing, and even reading about it going from a level 3 to a level 4 in Morocco. And the reason that they gave, which made a little bit more sense to me, it made me feel a little bit more comfortable traveling in a level 4, because I probably wouldn't normally travel level 4, is that they had in the beginning of September, I believe it's September, August, they had their version of Christmas. And so you had a lot of people coming in from all around the world, people coming together, families coming together. And so, of course, like you can imagine, when you have large gatherings of people for, holidays, there was a surge. And so that kind of upped the number in COVID cases, and that caused Morocco to move from a level 3 or level 2 to a level 4. That made me feel more comfortable knowing that, and also seeing that by the time that we were traveling, the numbers had decreased dramatically. And that's the other thing, a lot of people are not paying attention to the COVID number trends. And so I highly recommend making sure that you are following the COVID numbers. So in my case, we were noticing that there was a huge spike a couple of weeks prior to, which caused it to go to a level 4. But then as we were getting closer and closer to our trip, the numbers were going down, decreasing dramatically, going from 12,000 cases to 2,000 cases to 1,000 cases. And so it was trending in the right direction. However, had I noticed that the numbers were continuously trending in the wrong direction, I most likely would have canceled this trip. And again, that tells you, to constantly keep track of the COVID changes in terms of restrictions and for your destination, but also looking at the numbers and seeing if are they increasing or decreasing. One of the things I did a whole podcast episode on vaccination apps, whether you love them or hate them. I always recommend bringing your vaccination card, and don't rely on the digital version. Not every country accepts the digital version. A lot of countries want to see the actual physical paper version. And it's important to also have copies. So if you lose it or something happens to it, gets damaged, making sure you have copies is great. But making sure you have the physical card on you, and don't be caught out there thinking, oh, I have it on this app that I've been using in the States, so I should be good, or Clear has it, so I should be good. No, make sure you have the physical card, because there are countries who want the physical card, and when you don't have it, they're not going to let you in. And so you spend all this money on this trip, and you can't get in because you forgot this white little piece of paper. So don't get caught out there without the paper. The other thing that I found, I'll be the first one to admit, it's not something I do. I don't always read everything the airlines send, typically. Pre-COVID, I wasn't reading everything. They sent a bunch of information. So I'm like, yeah, right. Sure. I wasn't reading everything. In the midst of traveling internationally during COVID, one of the biggest mistakes you can make is not listening and reading all the emails that come. So again, I was saying I was brought 40 different people, women, on the ship with me to Morocco. And one of the women didn't realize that her flight had been canceled. And I don't know if she just didn't see the email, something that was miscommunication, but making sure you're reading everything. I was trying to read everything. I was reading everything to the point where I recognized that some airlines were requiring COVID tests. Some airlines were requiring COVID tests, even though you were vaccinated and the country didn't ask for it, 48 hours. Some were asking for 72 hours. So there were so many differences in that situation that I realized that, okay, I needed to read everything. And so in my situation, I read everything. I literally read everything for the airline I was flying on. And I thought I was good. I thought I was golden. However, I realized that, I didn't want to get caught out there. I didn't want to have a situation where I had gone through all this prep to find out that I wasn't, a vaccination wasn't good enough. Because the only thing Morocco was asking for was if you were vaccinated, you could get in with no issues. If you weren't vaccinated, you just had to have a COVID test within 72 hours. So as a person who was vaccinated, in theory, I was good. But no, I wasn't. A vaccination wasn't enough. When I got to the airport, even though I had read absolutely everything possible about traveling to Morocco, everything that the airline sent me or had on their website about traveling to Morocco, being vaccinated wasn't enough. I also needed to get a COVID test. Luckily, I had a COVID test, but this is the kicker that happened. So I got a COVID test maybe 2 or 3 days prior to my departure. And when I got to the airport in San Francisco, early crack of dawn in the morning, because my flight was at 7 o'clock, so I had to be there at like 4 o'clock in the morning, the woman was like, no, your COVID test is not valid. And I'm like, dude, I just got this COVID test and it's negative, so I'm really confused why you're saying it's not valid. And what she said, the document that, whatever she's reading said, is that you had to have a COVID test, X amount, it was either 48 hours, 70 hours before your destination. And so the way she read it was before landing in my destination. It wasn't where it could have been read by other people, and it was read by her colleague that was leaving from San Francisco. And so even if I was 48 hours before getting to my destination, I still had enough time. And she literally was about to not let me on the flight because of her interpretation of one sentence. It didn't say like 40 hours before arriving in Morocco, which again, my COVID test still allowed me during that time frame, but she wasn't paying attention on her own right. So make sure that you are looking at what it says and giving yourself some grace. So if you really want to make sure you're clear in the clear 100% to get into a country, give yourself 48 hours before landing in the country of your COVID test. Whether it says 72 hours or 48 hours, kind of give yourself that buffer, because people in the airline industry are reading the restrictions differently and interpreting it in their own way. And had I had not had her colleague be like, no, this is right, and me also saying, look at the time frame, I'm still within that time frame, and you were about to like make me miss my flight, I just smiled through it and woosawed. But that could have really, if I wasn't a person who's traveled a lot or wasn't alert or hadn't been reading up on so many different things, I would have taken her word as like, oh, dang, I just missed my flight because I didn't do this COVID test that I didn't even know about. So even if you are vaccinated, I highly, 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 highly recommend getting a COVID test and also printing it out. That was one thing I did make a mistake on. So I had a flight from San Francisco to Boston, Boston to Lisbon, Lisbon to Morocco. Yes, that was a lot. And I made it from San Francisco to Boston. That's when the first woman was like, nope, I don't think you get on this flight. I get to Boston to Lisbon, and the woman's looking at my COVID test. And I have Kaiser, and I had a COVID test through Kaiser, and I had it through the Kaiser app. I didn't think to print it out because it didn't dawn on me to print it out. And then I'm going through it, and the woman was like, oh, I need to talk to my supervisor, see if this is good enough. It has all this information. And what she was reading was all the pre-instruction information that Kaiser gives, and not just looking at the actual result. And I'm like, and I had to actually have her read it. I'm like, look, what you're reading is all the instruction parts, and it gives you if it's not negative or if it's negative. I mean, if it's positive or negative. I go, if you look right here, it says results, and it gives you all this information. So I had to literally talk her into reading the test. Had I had it all printed out, maybe that would have been different, or if I had it, from a different place. And so I encourage you to, not just have the digital version, but to also make sure that you get a printed copy of your COVID test results. Because the other thing I didn't have is internet in one of the places. And I'm like, oh, dang, I have to use my phone service to show that I actually have this COVID test when I was in Lisbon. Well, I thought I did. I actually didn't even need to show it in Lisbon. One of the things that also happened, not to me, but to one of my colleagues who was traveling with me, was she was traveling from Vermont, and they wouldn't let her on her flight to New York. Mind you, she was going from Vermont to New York, New York to Paris, Paris to Morocco. As you're getting a glimpse of this, there aren't many direct flights to Morocco, so we're all going from place to place to place to place, depending on where you're traveling from. And so in Vermont, they would not let her on the flight to New York, even though the flight from New York was the one going out internationally because she did not have a printed and filled out health form for Morocco. Mind you, I didn't get this form until, like, my airlines did give it to me in advance, and I could have filled it out, printed it out. I did fill it out. I just didn't print it out. And I was like, whoops, didn't print it out. But I, assumed that I would get it on the airlines and not an issue. And I did. My flight from Lisbon to Morocco, the airlines gave me the form. I filled it out and I was solid. However, for my colleague who was traveling with me from Vermont, she didn't have the form filled out or printed in Vermont before she even got to her flight to New York, and they wouldn't let her on the plane. So she literally missed the flight. They stopped talking to her, and that's a whole other ball game. But they wouldn't let her on the flight because she didn't have the form filled out. And I found that happened to other people too. So thank goodness for her having this experience first, that we made sure that other people knew to make sure they filled out the health form for the country in advance, had it printed out before even getting on any flights. And because you don't want to have something as simple as not having your form, not having your vaccination card, not getting COVID tests that you probably didn't need, but you need and didn't know that you need, to cause you to miss out on all this fun that you've planned for your trip. And so those are the kind of things that prior to leaving, I always recommend. And the other thing I always recommend is having snacks. Like making sure you pack snacks for, being in the airport, packing snacks for being on the flight, packing snacks for just, being out and about. Because, for me, we had a curfew in Morocco, and, if you're having jet lag or you're hungry at different hours, nothing's open. So you want to make sure you have snacks for those time frames. So that was kind of the general what I needed to do prior to traveling. So the things that I noticed when actually traveling and being in the airport is, first of all, ain't nobody social distancing in these custom lines. They had the little squares or whatever. It's like, keep your distance. People were in those long lines that go back and forth, and customs, like it was nothing. Like they were literally, no one was social distancing. I was trying to, and some people didn't have their mask all the way on. No one was checking them for that. And it was just like you're in a sardine situation. And someone coming from California, especially from San Francisco, where, you have to have a vaccination to even get into a restaurant, this felt mad uncomfortable for me. But no one was caring. Like they're like, it was pre-pandemic, and this line is long and I'm trying to get in, and the closer I get to you is the closer I get to getting out of these custom lines, which kind of felt really awkward and uncomfortable. One thing I did and I didn't see other people doing was, you're giving your passport to all these people who, most of them are not wearing, they're not wearing gloves, and they are touching 50 million different people's passports. And even if they are wearing gloves, they're not changing them in between touching your passport and someone else's passport. So I was wiping down my passport every time after I was giving it to someone else, and didn't wipe down my vaccination card just because, it was paper. Had I had it in a kind of a seal, plastic seal, I think that would have been better because I could have wiped that down. That was one of the things I wished I had done. But making sure that you wipe down your passport after people were touching it left and right. My high recommendation during these times, especially when you travel internationally, is BYOB plus P. Bring your own blanket plus pillow. I was traveling first class, so they did give you a blanket and pillow, and it was in the bag. But I was like, do I really trust their cleaning process and all this? And it's like, probably not, at least not for me. So I didn't, and I don't know what they were doing other places. And so I know on my flight from San Francisco to Boston, they were giving out no pillows or blankets, and it was early morning flight, and that's a flight that they would have. And so had I not thought about it in advance to bring my own blanket and pillow, A, I would have been freezing, B, I would have been uncomfortable. And so I'm always someone who wipes down the plane anyway. So that was something I was doing prior to COVID. And if you weren't doing it prior to COVID, this is something I do recommend to do during COVID, is to wipe down everything. If you are someone who wants to sleep and you have a window seat and you're sleeping on, putting your head on the, on the side of the plane, make sure to wipe that part off as well. I love the travel pillow that I got, and I'll actually put it in the comments under the show notes, because it kind of makes it so it's easy for me to, lie on my sideways, whatever different ways. The pillow I had was hella light. It fit into my travel carry-on bag, and so it was super easy to carry. But it was warm and comfortable at the same time, and it didn't add too much weight, which I'm team carry-on. I'm someone who doesn't like to carry a lot of things. Weight does matter because I have very limited space, and so having to add in my blanket and a pillow was extra weight that I wouldn't normally have thought about. It's something I had to consider, and I'd hate for someone to be out there, A, not having those things, or B, having those things and having things that are overweight. So something to always consider. Now traveling internationally during the pandemic, the other thing was to have disposable KN95 masks. Most airlines aren't going to let you have the N95 that have like the valve because it's not safe. It's safe for you, but not safe for people around you. So that wouldn't have worked for you to have one of those. The KN95 masks are the next best thing. And they recommend that you change your mask every 4 hours. So I was on one flight alone. From my flight from Lisbon back to San Francisco was almost 13 hours. And so they recommend that you change it every 4 hours. So imagine having one that is washable and just having that one. Well, you can't really change that every 4 hours. So having disposable masks and having tons of them was like clutch in these situations. So I was able to change my mask regularly. Not only when I was actually on a plane, but I was also changing my mask while I was out and about touring. So if I was out and about all day, I would change my mask every 4 hours, and I didn't have to worry about, oh, did I clean this one in time? Is it going to dry enough in time? I was able to be like, oh, okay, toss and go, and on to the next one. And so that was really helpful in that. The other thing I did, and it may not always be easy, and maybe I might have been a little bit paranoid, and I'm okay with being a little bit paranoid, was I was eating off schedule. Because I had my own snacks and I had my own food, I was able to not eat when everyone else is eating. Because everyone else is eating, it means everyone on the plane most likely has their mask off because they're all eating at the same time. And even when I was eating the food that the airline provided, I kind of waited a little bit and waited for people to kind of maybe finish. And so, yeah, the airline flight attendants might not have been the happiest with me, because I'm like, yep, I'm not done yet. I'm not done yet. Because I kind of waited for everyone to eat a little bit more, so there would be less people with their masks down. And so that's something that I decided to do to kind of just add an extra precaution in the process of while I was traveling. And then also, when you have things in your pockets and stuff like that, make sure to put those stuff in your carry-on bag. Like when you're going through the TSA checks and they're putting stuff on the bins, you want to have the least amount of things touching the bin. So, I've seen people who put their wallets and their keys, all those things. Like, those are all things you're going to have to wipe down after you take it out of the bin. So it's best to put those in an actual bag, or put them in a plastic bag. Put your food in a plastic bag, because I didn't want my food hanging out. Like, even if it was in a bag, I didn't want the bag to be touching the bins who are not being wiped down. So keeping that in mind, no one's cleaning those bins, or I didn't see anyone cleaning the bins in between uses. And so I was wiping down everything. And so the least amount of things actually physically touching the bins, the better. And that was the way it was for me. Okay, so you've made it on the flight and you made it to your destination. Woohoo! Things to consider when looking at accommodations and just, accommodations in general. And pre-COVID, or not pre-COVID, just the precautions that you need to think about. So at the hotel, I stayed in a riad, which is a smaller, how do I explain a riad? It's like a villa that has been turned into private like hotel rooms or boutique hotel rooms. And so it's like a cool little spot that I love staying in when I was in Morocco and Marrakesh. And I loved it because it gave me that unique experience of being in, something more traditional. And, being in America, I have stayed in a hotel, and most places will say that they aren't during COVID, that they aren't cleaning your room unless you ask them to. So I was under the impression that that was the same at my riad. Wrong. I come back from a day of being out and about in the Atlas Mountains, having an amazing experience hiking to a place that I never thought I'd hike, and learning about making Moroccan tea and all these other things. Till I'm like, wait a second, someone's been in my room. They've changed the sheets. And mind you, I'm someone, I was doing this again pre-COVID, but definitely during COVID, I wipe everything down. So if no one's coming in after I've wiped everything down, I'm feeling secure that I don't have to wipe down the lights and all these different, like the handles of the toilet and the sink and all these different things. But someone's come in, changed all these things, cleaned my room, and I don't know what they've touched. So then now I have to wipe everything down all over again. And so I did not realize that I needed to say, hey, don't clean my room. Because that happened in the hotel I stayed in as well as the Riyadh. So I had to specifically say, please do not clean the room, because I didn't want to have to worry about, is the person vaccinated coming in? Do they have COVID? Have they gotten COVID? Because they are working in all these spaces. And so making sure that you check to see what their cleaning process is. And if it is a place where, internationally, where they are still cleaning, and that's not something you feel comfortable with, asking them to say, hey, please don't clean my room. Other thing, one of the hotels had, it was all inclusive, and it had a buffet. I'm not a buffet person in the first place because people are nasty. I'm gonna keep it real. People are nasty. But even during COVID, more especially, like, I don't know where your hands were. Did you use hand sanitizer before touching this ladle and grabbing food? Did you just grab the bread with your hands? Like, I just didn't feel very comfortable in many different ways. And so I was happy that the hotel we were staying at had gloves so you could touch, the handles and different things. It had hand sanitizer all over the places. But if they don't, make sure that you are paying attention to, what is out and what you may want to not eat, may not want to eat, and that you're using gloves and, and not touching everything. Check in, see if there's contactless check-in, which is great. Not everyone has it, but that's great. One of the things that I did check into, because I wasn't so sure about, can you get COVID during, in a pool? Is it safe to be in a pool or a beach while traveling? And, how crowded is the pool or the beach? And, if you can get a private pool, like, if your place is like Bali, or even at some of the riads that I could have stayed at, I could have got a private riad that had a private pool, so I didn't have to worry about crowds. One of the things I was thinking about staying at this riad that's really popular on Instagram, Riyadh Yasmin. Beautiful location, gorgeous pictures, totally Instagrammable. And I was like, oh my God, this looks amazing. This is where I want to stay when I'm in Morocco. But then I started thinking about it. I'm like, this is a place that most people want to stay because it's very popular on Instagram. Meaning, even though it's this cute, boutique location, I gotta believe there's going to be hella people taking pictures by the pool and all the common areas, because that's what people do. And so it's not going to be as quiet, and it's probably going to be a little bit more crowded than I would want, than having a place where I can have a private pool on my own. And so that's something to consider if you can get a private pool, or, just a private space, like even a private garden where you're not around a lot of people. Look at accommodations that give you those options versus, or making sure that you're not going to be at a place that is like hella crowded. And so when you're looking at your destination, you're looking at your accommodations, kind of considering those different things, like your cleaning, the eating, how to check in, and how crowded is it going to be in the common spaces. The other things I wanted to bring up is like, okay, so you've, figured out how to get to where you're going. You've gotten your accommodations, you're all settled in, and now you're out and about. I talked about pools and beaches. Likelihood of you wearing a mask while swimming, pretty slim, because the mask is going to get wet. It's not really conducive to helping you out, so that's probably not what you're going to do. But I do recommend, when you are still at a beach or at a pool, to find ways to social distance as best as possible. You may not be able to get COVID through water, but you still can get COVID through people. And if there are a lot of people around, that's still a problem. So making sure to still social distance by the pool and at beaches. When you can wear your mask, wear your mask. I know it's not the sexiest thing, but getting sick while traveling internationally isn't sexy as well. So kind of pick and choose your battle of what is sexy and what is worth not being sexy. One thing that I personally experienced a lot in Morocco was that I had a lot of people locally and just in general be like, oh, I'm vaccinated, I'm good, you can take off your mask around me. And my thought process was like, nah, I can't. because my brother, who was or is unvaccinated, still got COVID while being vaccinated. There's still people who are vaccinated that are getting COVID. And my personal thought was, if I'm with someone who is a tour operator who is touring with several different peoples every single day, that doesn't mean you can't get COVID just because you're vaccinated. And so I felt a lot of pressure to not wear a mask because, people were saying, I'm vaccinated, you're vaccinated, we're both good. And science has shown that, yeah, the likelihood of you both being good is great, but that doesn't mean you can't get COVID even though you are vaccinated. And so I felt a lot of pressure and it felt uncomfortable. And when I was still wearing a mask and I felt sometimes disrespectful. And so sometimes I did take it off, like especially when I went to a local family's house in the mountains in Morocco. And I felt like I was kind of it showed that I didn't trust them. And and it was hard because part of me didn't, but then at the same time, part of me wanted to be respectful of the people who were allowing me to be in their house for a meal with them, a private meal at that. And so, again, I say pick your battles and know that, just because people say you should be comfortable, you have to do what feels right for you and what feels right for you. And so there were times where I was masked up when a lot of people weren't. And that's what worked for me. And I decided to trust my own intuition and trust my comfort level that made me feel good about my own safety. Because when I think about traveling, it's not just me. I take care of my parents. And so if I was to get COVID, that means that they are how many weeks or whatever, potentially without having assistance because I wasn't safe. And I took risks. And so, again, follow your intuition, see what works with you. On that note, consider private tours. I did do a lot of private tours. I did pay for things in advance. I was trying my best not to have to exchange money as much as possible. And so prepaying for things in advance so I didn't have to have money and exchanging money back and forth to different people. Also going on small private tours versus larger tours. You have a lot of people who you don't know where they've been, you don't know how they're vaccinated or not vaccinated. And so I found private tours to kind of be the best way to go to kind of mitigate any, safety issues that you're having. And that was what worked for me while being on my destination. And then the thing I really want to talk about, because this was really the thing that I think that we did not think about, and I don't know if people are thinking about in advance. So to get back into the United States, you need to have a COVID test. And whether you're vaccinated or not vaccinated, you need to get a COVID test within 72 hours of, getting back in the United States. Again, it goes back to that interpretation. I had situations where people weren't being allowed, their COVID test was being deemed expired because they got the test in Morocco, but they had, layovers in Paris or Portugal for extended time where they felt like it wasn't within the 72 hours of them arriving back in the States or 72 hours of whatever. And so making sure that you're timing your COVID test to be back into arriving in the United States within 72 hours. And it's making sure that you're looking at the timing because a lot of airlines were, especially Air France is one of the ones I really noticed that were kind of checking on it. We're paying attention to the timing and that was going to be expired because even though you got it 72 hours or 48 hours before leaving Morocco, it wasn't valid in France because of the timing. The other thing that I noticed that in France, the airport in Paris was saying that, yeah, you can get COVID tests, but you couldn't get a COVID test if you were someone who was in transit. So that was something that you had to, again, read the fine lines of traveling. And it was a lot to think about. Traveling, I did have a good time. It didn't feel exactly the same, but it didn't feel as restricted. Having a curfew definitely meant limitations about how much we could do. I felt like we had to cram a lot more things in because of the curfews and different restrictions that were happening. How many people could be in a spa, what was open, where you would eat, all these different things I had to think about. And there were challenges. I think what helped us is being prepared in advance and making sure we knew things. I also recommend, just in general, if you were thinking about traveling internationally, get vaccinated. I'm not going to go into any details of the pros and cons of whatever, but I encourage you to get vaccinated. I also encourage you to get travel insurance and make sure to check what is actually covered under COVID for travel insurance. Not everything is covered. And just, be prepared. Be prepared, be flexible, be patient. Things are just not the same, but you can enjoy yourself traveling internationally if you make sure to avoid some of these mistakes. Hopefully this was helpful. I am still a little bit tired from my trip, so I probably will talk about more about the trip on another location, another podcast episode. But for this one, I just wanted to give you guys things to avoid while traveling internationally. Other than that, I will talk to you guys soon. Have a beautiful Sunday and see you soon. Ciao. Thanks for joining us this week on the Hello Well with Danielle show. Make sure to visit our website, hellowellwithdanielle.com, where you can subscribe to our show on iTunes, Spotify, and Amazon Music and never miss an episode. Also, you can follow us on social media at Hello Well with Danielle on Facebook and Instagram, and Hello Well Danny on Twitter. And if you hella love the show and got some good nuggets out of it, know that I'm not too proud to ask for you to please leave a rating or review on iTunes so that we can continue to expand our reach and help other women of color. Again, thanks so much for listening, and I hope to see you next week. Ciao.